I was trying to stop the zombie apocalypse, not start it, by N.S. Lewis from r/nosleep. I'm trying not to panic, but it's hard because purple slime has been slowly oozing out of my eyeballs for the past hour, searing my cheeks like acid. My name is Brendan Pierce, and I've either just saved the world or doomed it. The horrible ocular discharge could, after all, be merely a side effect of the vaccine, like a slight fever after a flu shot. Or it could be a sign that I'm infected with a supercharged version of the virus of my own making that turned my best friend into a puddle of bubbling slime. Aaron's horrific death was also my doing. I thought it'd be funny to make him eat some tainted cantaloupe. I just thought it would taste bad, because it smelled so awful, like meat left out for weeks, crawling like a parasitic worm. I guess now that I write it out like that, I should have known. I should have known that Aaron's belly would have become distended at his organs and then bones melted away from the inside until the pressure built so much that his stomach burst open and it poured all over onto the floor. If I could go back in time, there's so much I'd change. The cantaloupe thing for starters. I'd also try to convince my former boss that his quest for a formula to make unperishable bananas, while certainly a cool idea, was not worth creating a super virus with the potential to wipe out humanity. And I'd also change everything I did after Aaron's death. If I could go back in time. But I can't change the past. I can only recount it. And now, as the slime starts to ooze out of my nose and burns my lips, I have to admit that I have screwed up on a global scale. And I don't have much time to tell you that I have doomed humanity for the worst death imaginable. Maybe somebody will be able to do something to save the world. But as small insects dripping in a purple slime start to push their way out of the pores of my arm, I know that it's not going to be me. After Aaron's death, I had a breakdown. I became convinced that the virus had been unwittingly created in the lab, was going to spread throughout the world and affect everyone on the planet. I couldn't sleep. I had waking nightmares. Visions of standing in a crowded street as everyone around me became brain-dead zombies and slowly turned to face me with outstretched arms. Then they started popping, like grotesque pimples, overripe with the deadly virus. Visions of men eating the flesh of men, of scorched earth, of rotten bananas, all swirling around in my head as a ballet of death and terror. I had to do something. I had to stop my nightmares from coming true. I still had my notes in the lab where the terrible thing was spawned. I used those notes to carefully recreate the virus in a makeshift lab that I set up in my basement, in the hopes of being able to use it as a vaccine. I went, I now understand, overboard. Rather than creating a small batch of the virus, I made enough serum to fill dozens of empty industrial waste drums. I was convinced that the world was in peril, and I needed enough vaccine to protect everyone. Still, I decided to experiment on the vaccine itself before I tampered with the bulk of the deadly serum. My first attempt to make the vaccine was to use radiation to kill the active agents in the virus. I'll admit that I didn't know exactly what the active agents were, but I figured that radiation would certainly kill them. As it turns out, I was terribly wrong. But at the time, I thought I was right. And so I made up enough vaccine to fill a large syringe, which I carried with me everywhere I went, waiting for the perfect opportunity. I knew that if I just kept my eyes open long enough, I would find somebody infected with the virus. I knew that it had already started to spread throughout the world, and that only I could stop it. And sure enough, one day while I was waiting at a subway stop, I saw somebody spontaneously explode in a woman, an unmistakable symptom of the virus. I never got a good opportunity to inject this woman with the potential vaccine, as a team of dangerous-looking people in hazmat suits swooped in and sent me running. But I did follow her and watch her have lunch with her secret boyfriend. I could also see the virus being transmitted across the lunch table from the woman to the man, so I followed him home and snuck up behind him. I was terrified myself as I jammed the needle in the side of his head and then ducked around behind a car. He looked around in confusion, no doubt wondering why the hell there was suddenly a stabbing pain in his brain. But it worked, and after standing dumbfounded for a few moments, he went inside. Now all I had to do was observe him for a bit and make sure that he didn't show any symptoms of the virus. I climbed up a tree and watched him through a window of his apartment. Things did not proceed as I hoped. The man's fingers began to grow into different bizarre items, like pencils that you could see trying to poke through a translucent layer of skin. The man's actual girlfriend kept cutting those weird fingers off, but they kept growing back. Now as keys, now as baseball bats. I was horrified by what I was seeing, and by the knowledge that rather than curing the man of virus, I had simply mutated into something even more terrible. Radiating the virus is not advised. I wrote that down in my notebook. The nightmares didn't stop. My initial failure to create a vaccine was discouraging, but the sense of urgency to succeed grew greater and greater as I went further and further off the deep end. I stayed inside for days on end, talking to myself, berating myself for failing. I kept working. If radiation didn't kill the active agent of the virus, then maybe heat would. So I set to work, boiling a sample of serum with scorching heat until I was sure that the active agent was dead. There were warning signs that I ignored. The vaccine wouldn't stop bubbling, for instance, even after it had been stored in a deep freezer overnight. Somewhere along the line, the guilt and terror became too much for my psyche to bear, and I so became the chosen one. I felt my brain crackle with electric energy and became convinced that I was destined to save humanity, and that there was no possibility of failure. Thinking back, I am horrified at how completely I broke with reality, but at the time, it was a defense mechanism to keep me going through the constant nightmares. I realized it was impractical for me to go around injecting everyone with a new vaccine myself. It would be much better if I could infuse it into objects that would transmit it through people's skin on contact. Then I could send the object out into the world in bulk. I settled on a necklace. I boiled the necklace in the vaccine until all the solution was gone from the pot and infused in the necklace. Then, I carefully packaged up the necklace. I never touched it directly myself, of course, just in case. After all, I thought I was the chosen one, and way too important to lose. I set the package on a random one's stoop and settled into some bushes to observe. And what I observed was so terrible that the horror began to seep through the cracks of my invented ego. The woman went inside and put on the necklace. The necklace began acting strange, and the woman began acting stranger. I told myself that it was just harmless side effects of the vaccine. But when the woman took the first bite out of her boyfriend's heart, I had to look away or risk giving into total despair. Heating the virus is not advised. I wrote that in my notebook. I have been experimenting with different chemical cocktails that might render the serum from a deadly virus into a world-saving vaccine. This time, I decided to experiment on mice instead of men. Each time a mouse exploded, I felt more and more sure that I was destined to save the world. Looking back now, when understanding has come too late, it's clear I had lost my mind almost entirely. The event that made me lose my mind 100% all the way happened when I was driving back from the store with more supplies. I was driving down a street in the suburb when I saw a very bizarre sight. A man was going around and mowing a lawn that had already been mowed as 4 uniformed police officers also performed redundant landscaping tasks. I felt a renewed sense of terror as I pulled off to the side of the road to observe. This is it, I thought. It's happening. A tan car came screeching down the road and went barreling through the yard that was getting excessively manicured. The car crashed into an apple tree, and a woman in a gas mask and plastic poncho jumped out of it. She pulled out a large blaster and proceeded to reduce the lawnmower man and the 4 police officers into puddles of goo. That's when my mind broke completely. There's no more time for fucking around, I thought. The chosen one must have faith and act immediately. I tore out of there and back home. I went down to the basement and looked at the stockpile of untreated virus. If radiating it didn't work, and heating it didn't work, and adding more chemicals didn't work, then the obvious answer was to radiate it and heat it and add a shitload of chemicals. That had to work. Or so I thought in my completely deluded state. I proceeded to do just that. Not to a small test sample, but to the entire stock. I was, again, convinced that both I had to act immediately, and that I couldn't fail. But now, the virus had worked its way to my brain and eaten away my psychic defenses. I see now that not only was my failure possible, any idiot could have seen it coming. I rented a U-Haul and have been traveling the country for the past week dumping my vaccine into all the major water supplies that I can. It happened at the Colorado River Aqueduct, which supplies water to much of Southern California. I dumped an entire 100-gallon drum of the serum in there, which I calculated was enough to inoculate the entire state of California, let alone the southern part, against the virus, assuming that the vaccine would do that, which I thought it would. I had gone 3 days without sleep and was letting out a yawn when a gust of wind blew some of the serum that I was pouring out back into my open mouth. Of all the strains of virus that I've seen, the variation that I created in my state of megalomania appears to be the very worst. My skin is on fire as purple slime oozes out of it. Bugs and worms are crawling out of every hole in my body, no matter how small. A tentacle has emerged from my throat and is feeling around in the air, hungry. I am, so hungry. And I know that what I'm hungry for too. Somehow, I'm hungry for people. At first, I was terrified. I was worried that I would explode. I'm still terrified, but the feeling is subsiding. This is who I am now. Part of me is still screaming in protest against this, but the screams are getting choked out. I am becoming a zombie of a kind worse than I have ever imagined possible. And soon, so will you. Not immediately, but as municipal water processing is almost agonizingly slow, but sooner than you think. And all I can do is tell you not to drink the water. I am so sorry. And hungry. So hungry.